Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Part 3, Chapter 42, The Need to Know.
Do we have to talk about this now?
Aeden asked. They were in the dining room, which still felt like home to him despite several major differences. At least now he was allowed to scrutinize the space openly without fear of being caught sneaking around.
She's right above us.
The unborn children of a woman are consummate gifts, Aeden. It's certainly nothing to be squeamish or embarrassed about,
Obry said. Overwhelmed, she sat back down, studying the arrow sticking out of the human shoulder.
I'm not embarrassed. It was the right thing to do.
Aeden's eyes expressed total conviction. He needed it to be the right thing to do, or his friend's death and his brother's fight for his life would be in vain.
Very well. Now sit down already. It's time to remove that. No more excuses.
Obry preferred to sound mildly irritated over the trembling caused by her distressed nerves. Aeden sat sideways on a dining room chair. At first, he'd ignored the dwarf, saying he needed to help Ruccharieu and Mitra and then attend to Azacca's body. Strapped to his back was a wooden shield he'd taken from the muscular necromancer's body. Careful it shouldn't scrape the arrowhead, he took it off. He wanted to become skilled at fighting with the shield, so he'd never again feel vulnerable against arrows or other ranged weapons. They had placed Ruccharieu on a dwarven bed over which his long elven arms and legs dangled. His breathing and pulse were so shallow that Kliyd had mistaken him for dead a few of the many times she'd checked his vitals. His Tika's sister had hardly left his side since she'd seen him collapse. Everything about the battle's aftermath was seared into her memory. She'd seen Aeden in fits of despair over Azacca as the bobcat had howled in anguish. She had heard Niwa sobbing over skeletal remains as she violently destroyed them. Now she would watch and wait and try to feel helpful.
Kliyd, I don't think I'm strong enough to do this. Can you?
Niwa had not finished requesting help when her sister bounded in and leapt onto the table. Obry watched with some dismay as the young Tika stood on her dining room table in her bare feet. On the other hand, the halfling's corpse was also on the table, so such propriety was basically moot.
Not from the fletching. It needs to pass through,
Kliyd said. Niwa had been tentatively reaching for the back of the arrow. Kliyd stopped to study the traces of dark magenta fluid around the entrance and exit wounds. She looked at her brother, who held a sheet to wrap Azacca's body.
May I use that?
Aeden handed her the sheet, then nearly jumped when Kliyd used her tail to produce a fine steel dagger from behind her back. Kliyd instructed her brother to brace the table as she wrapped part of the sheet around her hand and draped the rest over his lap. Aeden grabbed the table's edge firmly with both hands, and Niwa placed a nervous hand on his leg for support. Kliyd applied pressure to her brother's chest, then slashed upward, breaking the arrow. The fletching fell unceremoniously into the sheet on Aeden's lap. His sister was surprisingly competent at this.
Deep breath,
Kliyd said. She moved her hands to the exit wound on his upper back and swiftly yanked the arrow out. Then she wrapped the arrow, which had residual substance on it, in the sheet, not touching it directly. Ejecting the arrow had felt like a strong punch to the shoulder. He thanked his sisters and slowly let go of the table. He thought Kliyd handling the strange substance with great care was wise, and also wondered if the substance had affected him. Other than his obvious injuries and his fall from the boomstone explosion, he felt relatively well.
Can you lift your arm now?
Kliyd's soft voice carried a kindness she might generally reveal in actions, but rarely did in words. The care his sisters were showing him felt better than any relief he felt from the arrow being removed.
Yes,
Aeden said, rolling his shoulder. He felt self-conscious being the patient, which surprised him. He collected the arrow pieces, placing them in the corner with his new shield. Kliyd looked into Aeden's eyes, then at Niwa, before hopping off the table and returning to Obry's bedroom. She was eager to return to Ruccharieu's side. The young Tikis found it easier to process her thoughts and emotions alone with an unconscious brother than among people looking at her and engaging her in conversation.
This is all too much,
Obry said.
I'm sorry for what has happened to you all, but I can't have you children bringing war to my home. We're far too vulnerable as it is.
Zach brought us here.
Aeden struggled with mixed feelings for their host. She'd been right initially to be upset finding them in her home. But was she about to banish them from her house again? Like before, she'd reacted rather casually at first to their presence, even offering her upstairs sofa for Mitra's rest and her own bed for Ruccharieu's care.
Zach? I thought you said you met Azacca 2 days ago.
The dwarf huffed. She was being disingenuous, insinuating the nickname was too familiar, but not mentioning others had also used it.
It's true,
Niwa said.
He said he knew we were friendly.
We were the good ones.
Aeden added quietly, repeating the halfling's last words. He looked mournfully at the body and began dressing it with the sheet.
He probably told you everything. No, he wouldn't do that. What exactly did he tell you?
Obry's mind was racing.
I still can't believe you bought that woman, just days from delivering, and escorted her back here without knowing our objectives? What a remarkable coincidence.
It was the auctioneer who told us Mitra would be having a litter soon. Well, he announced it to everyone in town.
Now Niwa was standing on the dining room table, so she could help apply the sheets. She'd sobbed outside, but now resolved to try to clear her mind. She did find some solace in blurting out every detail she could recall about their travails before the ambush.
Soon is right.
Obry was pleased to change the subject.
I need to get Mitra to... With Azacca gone, I don't know what I'm going to do.
The dwarf, glancing at his shrouded body, barely maintained her composure.
I can't believe he's gone, and I won't be able to help this woman deliver a litter of Tikis by myself.
But you're Mama, aren't you?
Niwa asked.
What did you just say?
Obry's eyes widened. The young gnome felt uncomfortable. Obry was challenging her about the man whose slain body lay before her. Niwa felt Azacca was still present with them.
He was talking about working for a Mama, someone who frees Tikis slaves and has scouts working for her. I assumed it was a loving nickname for you instead of boss lady or something like that.
Enslaved Tikis.
Obry said.
What?
No one is a slave. We all have hopes and dreams. Some of us are enslaved by others, but we are never anything less than people.
The dwarf woman allowed a moment of unexpected silence from the room.
What are you children trying to do here? Are you mercenaries or spies? If you want to destroy us, just finish the job now. I can't fight in my current condition. I nearly collapsed the last time I defended myself from the likes of you all. You've got me right where you want me, but you'll never defeat us all.
Obry was shaking. Her face paled as she clenched her eyes shut. Aeden dropped to the sheet, preparing to grab Ruccharieu's body and flee the house. He feared the dwarf was about to generate that barrier field around herself again.
What is it about your current condition, Obry? Maybe I can help.
Aeden asked once he realized the magic wasn't forthcoming.
You mean healing?
Obry muttered angrily without opening her eyes.
You're not going to kill me. You're going to ask a god to kill us all? Is that it?
Aeden was speechless. What relationship was she suggesting between his healing hands ability and the beckoning of a god? Saba had once explained to him what a god was, but her explanation had felt abstract and impossible. But then Aeden considered Obry's phrase, "kill us all," and began to visualize his recurring nightmare. The beautiful woman with crimson hair, followed by black smoke, the fallen bodies of his companions. The smoke, or perhaps the woman, had killed them all. Aeden shook the image from his mind. Looking at Azacca's body, he remembered thinking after the ambush this nightmare would now be different. Another companion's lifeless body would be beyond the black smoke. To avoid the nightmare, he'd now been trying to stay awake no matter what. He couldn't face the anguish anymore, and he couldn't rest if his family needed his help. Kliyd returned.
I am a Tikis. This is my family. If you are rescuing the Tikis, then we're with you.
I am a Tikis, and these people freed me from the slavers and defended my life. Even the human.
Mitra called from the top of the stairs. She'd tried resting on the sofa, but had spent most of her time sitting up, trying to listen to these conversations.
Are you coming down? I can help you with the stairs again.
Aeden said loudly. His will to assist or defend was ingrained. He hadn't meant to ignore their host's accusations, but he certainly was getting tired of reassuring people of their good intentions. The room fell silent while waiting for a response from Mitra. Kliyd scurried upstairs. She wanted to offer her assistance before her human brother could. She understood this woman distrusted Aeden, likely all humans. Mitra's offhand comment to Obry made Kliyd wonder if, in this world, other people besides Tikis felt that way about humans.
We don't know any gods, and we don't want to kill anyone.
Niwa jumped off the dining room table.
We've been pursued and attacked by strangers ever since we tried to rest in some town called Silk Rhode because you didn't trust us then either. The only person on this planet who believed us was just attacked with us. But he insisted Mama was the god of the Tikis. I don't understand how everyone can be dangerous or distrustful. This world is a lonely, vicious place. If you want us to leave again, just say so. We'll find our parents again with or without you and your secret group.
Aeden felt shocked and impressed by his little sister.
What she said.
You're right.
Obry said with a sigh.
You're right that it's very difficult to trust anyone. Maybe I should have been more trusting of the children who broke into my heavily guarded home. Maybe other worlds are less lonely, as though I'd know anything about that. Of course. It almost goes without saying that on other planets, the Tikis are tiny and not beaten and raped and bred into generations of forced labor. Well, I'm glad you've stopped by with my colleague's corpse. He'd successfully liberated countless Tikis over the years. That is, before you lot came along. Please, won't you all stay for dinner? We'll just have to move the body out of the way first.
This was a mistake. We'll go.
Aeden said this calmly, despite the anger igniting inside him. He couldn't understand how, for a second time, the dwarf woman had initially appeared to be gracious and supportive, only to change dramatically a moment later.
Mitra said something about wanting to see someone named Sheer anyway. Maybe the bobcat can bring us there. And maybe that person can help with her litter, since you already said you can't.
Mitra and Kliyd descended the stairs carefully, with Sholfi right behind them. Kliyd wondered if this house motivated her to speak up more than usual. She struggled not to see it as her altered home.
Do you want to travel with us again?
Kliyd asked the larger Tikis quietly without looking up at her. She was once again the first to ask the woman what she wanted to do next. Upstairs, the Tikis woman had been in a tailor's room, replete with bolts of fabric and threads and needles. Some of the finished clothing looked as if it would fit her, with and without carrying a litter. Though tempted, she hadn't stolen any garments. She had marveled at the clothing sized for young children. Thinking of this, and with Kliyd's consideration for her well-being, made Mitra want to weep.
I'll be going with these children.
Mitra cleared her throat.
Perhaps if we go south, my children will one day see the mangrove trees.
She began to think better of fate.
The Sealot Islands, of course. That's Mitra.
Obry said.
My dear, you're very far from home. You can't just raise pups out in the wilderness.
But I will.
Mitra said, heading to the door.
I've done it before, and I'll do it again. If this little one is from a world where my children are mine to raise, then I shall forever dream of such a place.
Wait,
Obry said.
You already know there's a place for that. It's been my mission to keep it safe. Let me take you to the camp. You and your pups will be safe there.
The camp?
Aeden changed the subject.
Obry, you're right. Mitra is in no condition to travel. But aren't you also expecting? If your house is truly guarded, then why not deliver the babies here? Then we can all travel together when you're ready.
How could you know I'm expecting?
Obry shouted.
That must be it. You're not going to kill me, but you'll claim my house as your own. You said as much the other day.
Ma'am, you are so paranoid about us.
Aeden said.
In case you didn't realize, as soon as you talked about feeling weakness, I guessed you were with child, which must be very difficult to handle alone. That's why I offered to help Mitra, and why I offered to help you. Yes, I have my healing, but the fight exhausted me, and I couldn't save Zach or my own brother, and that's on me.
I think we're all on the same team here.
Niwa said.
Obry, I think it would be best if Mitra got to this camp as soon as possible. Those people could be here at any moment. It will be easy to transport her before she has her pups. Does Sholfi know the way?
Niwa assumed Obry would likely know the bobcat's name.
You need help, Obry. Let us help you,
Aeden said.
Very well.
The dwarf said. It occurred to her the bobcat did know the way, even if she refused to tell them.
I'll give you directions to the camp, but my work is here. Another colleague is arriving in the morning, should I need anything. So you don't need to worry about me. I'll look after the young elf. He is the last person who should be traveling in his current condition.
We can't leave Rook,
Aeden said reflexively.
Now you know how difficult my decisions are.
Obry said.
He'll recover soon.
Niwa wished to inquire more about this colleague, but minded her business.
We can't split the family up.
Aeden barked, immediately regretting his forcefulness.
I apologize for that.
In the other room, everyone could hear water splashing, followed by a scream. Chapter 43. Southpaw. Ruccharieu opened his eyes. His right arm was bright turquoise from his fingers to his elbow. He noticed its translucent properties, having barely touched Oxbow's hand. He remembered the genie explaining another of his kind shared Ruccharieu's elven body, and this strange symbiosis was the only reason the arcane poison could be purged. He'd finally seen and touched the man who'd captivated him since he'd first heard the genie's voice. When their hands had touched, Ruccharieu's arm had appeared to atomize into nothingness, frightening the young man and rousing him into abrupt consciousness. Was his arm truly gone? That might mean the genie's hand was extending beyond his upper elven arm. The elf was in a bed so short his feet dangled off the edge. The room seemed vaguely familiar. Then he heard his siblings talking with Obry in another room and understood they had reached her after all. To hear Kliyd, Mitra, Aeden, then Niwa speak was to know they'd survived. He moved the arm as nearby candlelight illuminated its watery composition. Aeden was now arguing with Obry, saying they didn't want to split up the family. They were discussing him. He felt stressed and uncomfortable hearing Aeden take this tone with their host. Ruccharieu connected the two hands. The watery hand was cool to the touch, but registered no feeling. He then gasped when his elven hand passed into the turquoise form as though it were submerging into water. He flinched, and suddenly his elven hand was touching nothing, as the turquoise hand collapsed into a puddle of water, causing him to scream. His siblings rushed in to investigate.
I couldn't possibly explain what just happened,
Ruccharieu said, looking from his wet clothes to his siblings. Then he realized how happy and relieved he was to see his family alive and well.
I could explain what it looks like,
Aeden said, glancing at the wet blanket. Kliyd was the first sibling to smile. To see the Tikis express such happiness was so rare it almost surprised Ruccharieu as much as the loss of his own limb. Then she noticed it was missing, though she had just seen his body intact a moment ago. He smiled back. All the siblings were smiling and grateful to be reunited. Then, a new, watery arm began to coalesce out of thin air. In an instant, the elf was once again moving turquoise fingers.
I can't feel this, but I seem to control it,
Ruccharieu explained, nearly laughing at the limb's return.
I desperately wish I could explain it. It's water and possibly some sort of arcana?
Did that sorceress do this to you?
Aeden asked with some consternation.
Not this,
Ruccharieu answered, raising his arm.
She used some sort of arcane poison that possibly killed me.
Possibly?
Niwa repeated with gentle skepticism. Ruccharieu began to explain his surreal meeting, flushing and speaking apprehensively as he described Oxbow. Obry appeared at the doorway. Respectfully, all the siblings faced her.
I'm pleased to see you've recovered, Rook,
Obry said, glancing at his arm.
I've written directions. Mitra has them, along with some travel food. Unfortunately, I don't have much drinking water in reserve, but I'm certain you all are resourceful enough to have come this far. Please make sure that Mitra and the pups get enough food and water. I don't wish to sound so parental, but I suppose practicing now will be helpful.
Kliyd perked up and dashed from the room.
I know we must seem like trouble more than anything else, but I sincerely thank you for your hospitality, Obry.
Ruccharieu was unfazed by Klyd's abrupt disappearing act.
Evidently, there's a water spirit called a Jinni living inside me. So, spells like Create Water will not be a
He stared at his turquoise arm, looking mildly distressed.
Oh yes, we've got water covered,
Niwa said reassuringly, but she watched her brother with concern.
We'll get to the camp safely, I promise. But just so we're clear, you don't want us to come back and help you afterwards, right?
Aeden was afraid of sounding paternal, knowing it would only irritate their host.
Thank you, Aeden.
The dwarf said.
I'll be fine. If Rook is feeling better, I do recommend leaving right away. It's not that far. You'll arrive in the middle of the night, but the camp never sleeps. My letter is with the directions. Show that to anyone, and they'll find lodging for you all.
Kliyd reappeared. She had her hands full of glass bottles from the cellar. No one had noticed her approach, and not a single bottle had clinked as she'd scurried back.
These are empty, and they smell clean. Please fill these with water, Rook.
The young Tika squeezed past Obry, placing the bottles neatly beside the bed. She looked vaguely at the dwarf, but made no eye contact.
Certainly.
Ruccharieu started and then stopped the arcane gestures to create water. He picked up a bottle and stared at his hand, looking distressed again.
Casting feels different somehow. It's this hand. I just don't understand it. All of my spells are water spells, and that's all I know, isn't it? I've studied with Gorham for years now, and yet everything I do revolves around water. How have I been this myopic for this long? It's not as though our father only taught such spells, but I've always engineered the Arcana to make it about water. Am I just limiting myself? What does that say about me?
Rook.
Aeden tried to assuage his brother.
Oh,
Ruccharieu said, perking up.
This was a good idea, Kliyd. My apologies. Could you hand them to me one at a time, please?
Not casting a spell, the elf held his turquoise thumb over the bottle's opening. At first, nothing happened, and he sighed. His mind worked on the problem, then the water began to flow through without depletion. His eyes widened. Kliyd handed him the next bottle. Steadily, he filled 6 bottles with pure water without any tangible damage or loss to the turquoise limb.
Thank you for trusting us, Obry. We'll leave for camp.
Aeden said.
Wait,
Ruccharieu said, sitting up straight.
I don't know how to ask you this, but this talk about trust compels me to say something. And I know you didn't recognize the names of our parents, Saba and Gorham, when we mentioned them before. Do you know who lived in this house before you did, Obry?
The dwarf considered the question.
I've only lived in this house for a few years. It's an outpost belonging to the dwarves. Is that what you're getting at? I'm sure plenty of dwarves have lived here. The house is very old. We always keep the cellar stocked for the next residents, as you have seen.
Outpost. That's what Saba called it.
Ruccharieu perked up.
When we first met you, we were looking for them. We still are, of course. Her journal described an outpost where she and Gorham used a camera obscura to jump across worlds. I really thought this might be the place she meant. She wrote that the outposts haven't seen many travelers since something called the Dwarven Fortune.
I need to stop you there.
Obry said, taking a deep breath.
Your parents sound very interesting. We dwarves are always on the move. So it's possible they've lived here before. I wouldn't know. I'm going to stay here because Sheer needs me. Frankly, I need her too. The Dwarven Fortune happened so long ago, but it continues to make life difficult for all of us. I've made a lot of sacrifices in my life because of it. Please, just go.
The siblings watched Obry close her eyes, resisting the urge to cry. They quietly passed by, leaving her in peace.
One other thing.
Obry said.
I ask that you bring Azacca with you. My colleagues will want his remains, and they'll know what to do.
The dwarf looked at the halfling's body on the table. Her breath quivered with sadness.
Of course.
Aeden said. He looked within himself for reserves of healing energy, but his mind and body remained exhausted. He knew the healing power replenished with rest, but rest was on the other side of a nightmare he wasn't ready to face. Chapter 44. Hopelessly Lost. The siblings carefully navigated past the protective spells surrounding Obry's home. Kliyd stopped for a moment to study the coop with its chickens nestled and sleeping. In the still hours of this cloudless night, they continued toward the mysterious Tika's camp.
I thought she was going to make another barrier to push us out.
Niwa said.
She says she sacrificed a lot. I hope she doesn't push everyone out of her life.
We're going to meet the person she says she needs.
Aeden said, frustrated.
I don't think it's a sacrifice to refuse help. People need other people. Sounds more like paranoia. If someone had just been attacked near my house, I'd help them and let them rest.
Ruccharieu had insisted he was all right and that they should honor Obry's wishes.
Aiden, she lives alone by choice. We can't just show up and insist we're helpful.
He continued, trying to be more diplomatic.
Besides, I don't think there was sufficient room for all of us to sleep inside.
It's the same house. It didn't shrink.
Aeden argued without conviction. He wanted to lead, and he wanted to obey, wishing he could be in two places at once. If the siblings could only stay, he thought he could soon heal again. He also wanted to help deliver the children soon to be born, and maybe even revive Azacca, if that were possible.
Nothing here is the same.
Niwa had imbued her copper doha with a light spell once they were outside.
We want things to be the same, but they aren't. The house is different. The landscape is different. Raven's Cross is definitely different. I've been looking for echoes of home this whole time, but I think if anything seems similar, it's because all people have certain things in common, and those things become patterns.
That's the most astute thing I've heard in a long time,
Ruccharieu said. He remembered her playing around with makeshift torches only a few nights ago. Tonight, she seemed focused, equipped with a more effective light source. He saw this change as a metaphor for how far they had come.
You're absolutely right, Niwa. I think even we've been forced to change in order to simply survive. I know I'm different now, that's for sure.
Gorham could have used the chicken coop.
Kliyd said her realization out loud.
Use the chicken coop? For what?
Niwa thought she had misheard her sister.
The camera obscura. It's a dark, square room. Obry might have repurposed it. Maybe dwarven outposts all look like that house. He didn't use the cellar there. It's not the same house.
Kliyd thought to disprove Aeden's statement.
Remarkable. You might be absolutely right, Kliyd. I wish Saba's journal was more clear. There is so much of this world in our homeworld that we've never seen. If the dwarves travel all the time, maybe there are outposts everywhere.
Ruccharieu sighed, feeling like this mystery was a puzzle growing in size. The young mage flexed all his fingers. Since leaving Obry's house, he'd discovered he'd retained complete control of his body, including his mysterious turquoise hand. Ruccharieu had figured out he could manipulate the shape of his hand, or he could dismiss the form entirely, then assemble another from an unseen font of water.
That is the craziest thing I've ever seen,
Niwa said, watching her brother sculpt his new arm into a shape similar to her walking stick, then let it splash to the ground, only to create a new hand again.
You're walking next to a bobcat as big as Skunk, and you make real people appear and disappear just by talking about them. And this is the craziest thing you've ever seen?
Aeden sounded playfully sarcastic, but also frustrated. Struggling to stay awake, he became increasingly irritable.
I think about Skunk often. I wanted to open his paddock gate before we left.
Kliyd looked at Azacca's wrapped body, fastened to Shelfie.
We left him trapped, and they probably killed him.
Aeden recalled the intense fog their mother had summoned that day, and also the burning arrow that had struck their home. He tried to clear his mind.
Nobody's getting killed. I'll protect all of you. Miss Mitra, please let me see those directions.
Mitra hadn't opened the folded paper yet. She looked at the human with apprehension, deciding she'd look at the directions first.
Obry gave the directions to Mitra because she probably trusts her more than us,
Niwa said.
She can hang on to them herself.
But I was going to lead us there.
This unexpected pushback had released adrenaline in Aeden. In truth, all the siblings were fatigued. They had last rested with a jovial, hospitable Azacca, but this felt like ages ago. In one day, so much had changed.
It's not about who's leading right now,
Niwa said.
We're all going together. Besides, if anyone knows where we're going, it's Shelfie.
The gnome petted the large beast and forced a wan smile.
I can't read this.
Mitra covered her mouth after admitting this, wishing she hadn't. She stared at the directions, afraid if she made eye contact, she'd see their disappointment, frustration, or anger.
What do you mean?
Niwa asked gently, holding her doha higher for better lighting.
It's Tikas writing.
Kliyd explained, looking over Mitra's shoulder.
Obry wrote out directions for Tikas to read. That's fascinating.
Ruccharieu wanted to move closer to Mitra to see for himself, but didn't want to crowd her.
What? Let me see that.
Aeden commanded.
I can read a map.
You can't read it either, Aeden.
Niwa held out her hand to keep him back.
It's not a map at all, just some writing.
Why would Obry do that to us?
He lamented.
Because I was right.
The gnome said, feeling smug.
Please take this. I only know a little and was never taught to read.
Mitra offered the paper to the smaller Tikas. Kliyd felt self-conscious. She remembered the way she felt after training with Gorham. Her siblings were looking at her, expecting something from her. It was not her style to lead.
Kliyd, did Gorm or Saba ever teach you to read Tika's script?
Ruccharieu asked, then regretted the connotation of his question.
I mean, I'm thankful you can help us with this. I don't think I've ever seen that writing before.
No,
Kliyd said. After skimming the directions, she'd realized she didn't know why she recognized the writing. This realization blossomed in her mind, beckoning for more soul-searching, but that would have to wait.
I must have learned very young.
I suspect you're right.
Ruccharieu became preoccupied.
I think we all need to compare notes about our earliest memories at some point. I never asked enough questions because I thought maybe Gorm and Saba were protecting me from some early trauma I'd forgotten. They certainly didn't tell me that my body was occupied with some other being.
The elf's fatigue was exacerbating his temper.
So, what do the directions say?
Aeden asked Kliyd.
What does our past say?
Ruccharieu shouted at his brother. He felt ignored. The latent adrenaline set Aeden's nerves into overdrive. He stepped close to his brother, shouting.
It says we should stay on track and get to a safe place where crazy people stop attacking us for no reason. It says to think about having a future, too.
I don't have a past.
Ruccharieu began to sob.
This arm, that wild dream or near-death experience or whatever that was, my body is just a host for some otherworldly being and nobody ever told me until my body died. This was never me casting spells or trying to be an exemplary student. The water genie inside me was doing it all. I thought Arcana came easily for me. I wasn't enhancing spells with water embellishments. I was trying to cast spells. But this parasitic creature inside me can only manipulate water. All that studying and I haven't accomplished anything.
Stop it.
Niwa yelled.
Rook, you've accomplished so much. And Aeden, you said we can't split the family up. What do we have if we don't have each other?
Aeden flinched. He recalled the cloud of ash followed by all the bodies covered in blood.
I didn't ask for this.
Ruccharieu cried.
This water wouldn't even let me die on my own.
The elf thrust his turquoise arm skyward. To everyone's surprise, a geyser of clear water ascended far into the night sky. The strange arm was gone. He stared upward, bewildered. Chapter 45. Higher Ground. Niwa dropped her doha and rushed to hug her brothers.
We'll get through this, but we need to rest. Obry said it wasn't that far. You're not going to die, Rook.
Definitely not.
Aeden leaned into his sister's hug and took a deep, cleansing breath. Kliyd had begun to feel overwhelmed as tension had escalated between her brothers. She focused on the directions, trying to identify their current position instead of her grief.
We'll pass these hills on our left.
The Tikis sighed, relieved. She thought to give more directions, but remembered Obry was concerned that the siblings were being followed. She secured the paper in her vest. Ruccharieu noticed the slopes rising beyond the light produced by Niwa's spell. He wondered if a map would have been futile, given they were traveling with such limited visibility. He also considered his ability to cast the light spell. Had he misspoken about his abilities? Maybe he did have some inherent skill after all. Without warning, torrential rains began to pour, reducing visibility even further. The group scrambled and began to hustle onward.
Where did this storm come from?
Niwa shouted over the noise of the pounding rain. The long and tiring day had just got even longer, and she was miserable.
Why is the ground getting softer?
Aeden shouted, confused.
We have to get out of this. Are we sinking?
The flash flooding was saturating the ground, and mud was beginning to drag the group down. They had never experienced a rainstorm this sudden and severe before. When Ruccharieu looked up at the sky, he could still see distant stars. While he typically loved being out in the rain, he suspected this rain had to do with the water genie he'd just tried to expel from his body.
Head for higher ground.
Aeden yelled through the downpour. He started marching up one of the hills. Though seeing was difficult, the human watched the light from his sister's doha moving forward. He hoped it meant the others were following his lead. Ruccharieu began casting a spell, then stopped and groaned. He didn't have both his hands to complete the spell's gestures. Undaunted, he started casting the spell again with both arms and one hand, slowly. After a few arcane words, the bubble spell began to expand over his head, continuing to grow outward and creating a large dome of air that blocked the rain. He moved closer to Mitra and Shofi and his siblings. and one by one that bubble enveloped them in arcane shelter.
Spectacular. Thanks, Rook.
Niwa sniffed as rain dribbled down her nose.
Is everyone all right? Mitra, how are you doing?
Ruccharieu asked anxiously.
Yes, I'm fine. Thank you.
Mitra was leaning on Shelfie the bobcat for support. Everyone was soaked.
Aeden is still climbing,
said Kliyd, pointing to a hill barely visible in the darkness and pouring rain outside of the bubble.
We have to get to him,
Ruccharieu said.
Should I go get him and come back? I don't think we should all climb that.
I'll go,
offered Kliyd. She recalled training with one of Gorm's uncanny image spells and becoming exhausted. A part of her wanted to prove she could endure more.
Kliyd, wait.
Niwa held out her doha, still glowing with arcane light. The Tikis grabbed the item with her tail as she left the bubble for the hill. Aeden had continued to ascend the hill even as runoff and mud impeded him. He'd grab a nearby rock or branch to aid his advance. After a bad misstep, he nearly fell and realized this climb would be too difficult for the others, especially Mitra. He wanted to stop and catch his breath, but the rain complicated his every move. Holding on to a large branch, he looked back, relieved to see his sister's doha with its imbued light drawing near. Kliyd could see her brother was panicked after realizing she wasn't in Niwa.
Rook used Arcana! We're all safe! Come back down!
Just as suddenly as it had begun, the rain ceased. Aeden and Kliyd looked at each other, surprised.
You must have said the magic word,
Aeden said as he tried to stand. Kliyd saw how weary he was, and appreciated him making the effort to smile. She returned the smile, then climbed higher to help him get back down. Then, she caught a quick glint of light uphill. She tried to find the light source again, moving her tail and the doha around. Another glint of light reflected off something.
What's the matter?
Aeden asked.
Something is up there. I'll be right back.
She scurried up the hill.
Wasn't that Aeden?
Niwa asked. They'd watched her illuminated sister stop beside another figure.
Is she passing by him?
I'd assume so,
Ruccharieu said. He'd dismissed his spell, and now they were all waiting and wondering.
Rook, you cast that spell without your blue arm,
his sister said.
If that other being wasn't with you, then that means it was your spell after all.
Ruccharieu considered this, feeling ashamed.
Perhaps. That water genie could have gotten us killed, and now Aeden's up there hanging out to dry. This is all my fault.
We don't know what just happened,
Niwa said.
But at least you have most of your old self back.
Ruccharieu noticed Mitra was drenched. She was sitting in the mud, still leaning against Shelfie.
My sincerest apologies, Mitra. We can rest for a while. I feel awful for putting you through all this.
I know you didn't mean to.
The Tikis woman said wearily. She placed a hand on her belly and took a few breaths. He crouched nearby while still giving her space. When his elven hand touched the mud, a familiar synaptic feeling coursed through him. The water contained in the mud was a comfort he'd sought his entire life. Steadying himself in his crouch, Ruccharieu lowered his other arm. Like a wick, his arm pulled the water from the mud, and his turquoise hand began to reform.
The spirit never left.
Mitra had begun to feel more comfortable as her clothes and the ground had dried out.
After all that, my body's still not my own.
Ruccharieu sighed, then stood again.
Freedom only lives in dreams.
Mitra studied the elf with eyes that seemed to understand everything. Shelfie was now lying down and resting beside Mitra. Niwa wandered over and sat beside the Tikis, who nestled into the giant bobcat's fur and fell asleep. Chapter 46. View from a Hill.
This place is a disaster. No wonder it's in ruins. How do you get food and supplies up here on a regular basis?
Kliyd was shocked to find someone on this hill. After climbing to the hill's crest, she'd discovered a small campus of dilapidated buildings in a grassy crater. She halted at the ridge to observe the man speaking.
I wonder how many people you have to murder to get a statue made in your image.
The man said with a scoff, studying the large statue in the crater. His back was to Kliyd, and she wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself.
I bet history probably calls this guy a great hero.
The Tikis felt a paroxysm of panic when she realized the doha's light, the only light source on this hill, was in the grasp of her prehensile tail. The man must be aware of her presence, talking to her.
You know, I've never been up here before.
The man rested his hands on his hips.
But I bet you could see the camp if you knew what you were looking for. That's probably not good for us.
He must be another hallucination, standing there in the darkness alone with no light source. This realization put Kliyd slightly at ease. He turned, and she was surprised to see a hobgoblin about Aeden's age. She'd first seen hobgoblins only a few days ago, when they'd ambushed the siblings at the lake, prompting the ordeal eventually bringing them to this harsh world.
I don't think I've ever seen you around camp before,
The hobgoblin said.
I'm Gusk, and you are way off the beaten path. If Zach was sending you to camp alone, he gave you horrible directions.
Kliyd's eyes widened hearing Azacca's name. This man must be talking about the Tikas camp. Given her experience with hobgoblins, she was afraid this hallucination was warning her the Tikas camp was in danger.
You don't really look like a Tikas,
Gusk said.
You're kind of a runt or something. Then again, who am I to talk? I've never seen another hobgoblin before, so maybe I'm a runt too. I don't mean to judge you, but I know it's hard not to feel lonely sometimes.
This man was pleasant and affable, which ran contrary to everything she thought she knew about hobgoblins. Though he had those fearsome teeth protruding from his underbite, his body was lithe and his black hair was tied back neatly behind his pointed ears.
I think that building over there was some sort of lodging.
Gusk nodded to a simple structure that looked about to collapse.
There were some wheels beside it wrapped in rope. Do you suppose people used to rappel down this hill when they needed more supplies? I'm telling you, that must have been a nightmare.
Kliyd had begun to suspect one component of these hallucinations was her mind helping to discern details beyond what she already saw and heard. Gusk's fabric bandolier was twisted into small segments, which seemed somehow familiar to her. He had mentioned a rope. Kliyd hopped off the ridge and headed for that building. She easily found the rope and the wheels. Holding the light overhead, she recognized a pulley system. Although it hadn't been used in a long time, the system looked serviceable. The long rope was a strange black vine. At first, suspicious of the rope's durability, Kliyd tugged and pulled at it in several places before deciding it was safe to use for the bigger folk. She secured the rope to a nearby post, which had more structural integrity than the adjacent building, and fed the rope through the pulleys. The rope was enough length to reach down to her family. Kliyd had finished preparations in only a few minutes, but, as she'd expected, the friendly hobgoblin was gone, leaving her alone and weary on this dark hilltop. She secured the rope to her waist, climbed over the small ridge, and began her descent. When Aeden became visible in her sphere of light, she was surprised to see he'd waited for her. She delighted to see her brother look up at her so hopefully. The two grabbed the vine and descended the hill together, which was much easier than the initial climb, and reunited with their family. Kliyd had mixed feelings about convincing them to go to the crater, but her main concern was if they were being followed, and if they were attacked, they'd be summarily defeated because they had no fight left in them. On the next episode, the wary travelers ascend the slope as Kliyd suggests, only to find a hidden campus.
Maybe it's different during the day, but just looking at this hill, you wouldn't know this place was up here.
The buildings around them appear to be abandoned, but are they really alone?
Are you sure this place is deserted, Kliyd?
The greatest challenge facing them now is finding shelter and safety for a good night's sleep.
The rest of this building is being held together by a few nails and some hope.
A new place offers new adventure, but first they have to make it through the night. Chapter 47, Rat's Nest. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun, Episode 9 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Kliyd, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Bill Robinson as Aeden, Jason Pagano as Ruccharieu, Sarah Luz as Mitra, Alicia Robinson as Obry, and Patrick Sanders as Gusk. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed, and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.